Demonic item duplication. Growing up in a house where my mother developed schizophrenia was not an easy experience. Our house was located in a unique spot. It was right under a water table on the edge of a vast woods, down the street from a Native American reservation, and down the street from a Catholic and Protestant cemetery that faced each other. It was also on the edge of a marsh. Looking back now, I realized that our old house was a nexus of spirits, a passing point, and in particular, I feel like there were more inhuman spirits than anything. As my mother's condition worsened, she began to research the occult due to her own experiences as a kid. She attempted to use a spirit board to converse with her voices, and she used that board to the point that it wore her down. I never liked the way it felt, and I never trusted that she was doing things properly. Unfortunately, after this became a pattern of behavior, there all of a sudden started to be a lot of tense activity in the house. One time in particular, I was playing the SNES game, Kirby Superstar. It was 8 games in 1, while my grandfather and uncle were stripping my mom's room of the umpteenth time. I was trying my best to ignore this and just play my game. When they finished, I was left in my hallway of a bedroom. I finished the final battle with Marks and turned off the game and went to put it into my big-ass entertainment center. That's when it happened. As soon as I opened the door, all the games, they felt weird. It was an instantaneous feeling. I reached in and grabbed a game cartridge, pulled it out, and instantly realized it was the exact same cartridge of Kirby Superstar. And when I say exact, I mean down to the dirt and grime that it was the other cartridge in my hand. I left them next to each other and I was overwhelmed with the feeling of how wrong and bad this felt. I immediately felt like this was not normal. I had no cousins that lived near me, and there were no kids around my age that I grew up with that could have left this with me. No one went in or out of my entertainment center the few hours I was sitting in front of it. There was simply no explanation, so of course, I had to try playing it. I cautiously put it into the Super Nintendo, making sure I could tell which one I was originally playing and which one was the wrong version. I turned it on and immediately felt that there was a strange graphical interference. Red, blue, green colored lines streaking into weird fractaled static, flashing on and off, from that to black. Within a few seconds, there was a loud, high-pitched electronic sound that almost sounded like a squeal, and it filled me with deep dread. I turned it off immediately, now sweating and panting, and put in my original cartridge. All of my game saves were gone, and it was as if I'd never played the game before, like it was a fresh copy. This experience made me panic, and I tossed the demon copy into the trash. I went downstairs to calm down, but an hour or so later, I found it sitting on top of the microwave. I don't have the courage to ask anyone if they had dug it out, so instead, I grabbed it and shoved it into the bottom of the trash so no one can see it and throw it out. After this incident, I never had anything else duplicate itself like that, but shortly after, I had random personal items be there 1 minute and then disappear, never to be seen again. I remember a Game Boy Color. It fell right behind my bunk bed into the dark under it, only to have never been found ever again, and I grew increasingly uneasy about what was happening in the house. My mother's schizophrenia and her fascination with the occult only added to the already eerie atmosphere of the house. Located under a water table on the edge of a vast expanse of woods near a Native American reservation and near a cemetery where Catholics and Protestants were buried next to each other, the house seemed to be a nexus of spirits. I couldn't help feeling that they were more inhuman spirits than anything else. Living in that house was a harrowing experience. The combination of my mother's schizophrenia and her interest in the occult, the location of the house, and the strange occurrences made it feel like a nightmare. Even though I left that house long ago, I still feel a sense of unease whenever I think about it. Nighttime horror. A few weeks ago, something happened to me that kept me up at night. I can't stop thinking about it. You see, I've been suffering from night terrors for the past 6 years. I think that's what it was anyways. I feel like my eyes are open and I'm aware of my surroundings, but I see things that aren't there. At least that's what I always thought. Some people have suggested that it might be sleep paralysis, but I've never been aware that I can't move, if that makes sense. I always thought that you couldn't move in sleep paralysis. Maybe one of you will know. I don't know what causes these night terrors, and I don't really know how to control them. I've somewhat gotten used to them, though, as they happen a few times a week. Normally I see a tall man standing behind my door. He doesn't do anything, just stands there silently and watches me. When I come home around the property, it's just my dressing gowns or coats hanging on the back door, causing the shape of a tall man. And every time it happens, my heart beats out my chest for a few seconds. But mostly I can roll over and go back to sleep. On this particular night, I was in that sleep-awake state again. My bedroom door swung open, and a child walked into my room. At first, I didn't think anything of it, as I have 2 children, an 8-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy. It was dark being the middle of the night, so I just saw the little figure. I watched the child walk around to my bed, to the foot of the opposite side of my king size, as if it were going to climb on the other side. I said, "Hey, are you okay?" But they didn't reply. Without me feeling them climbing on the bed, a hand grabbed my foot, maybe 5 feet away from where they were previously standing. I have terribly ticklish feet, so I accidentally kicked out when they did, and kicked the child that I didn't feel climbing on my bed in the first place. My heart sank and I rolled away to turn on my lamp, saying, "Oh, sorry. When I turned back, there was no child. I jumped out of bed thinking I'd knocked them off the bed or something, and I didn't hear it, but there is no child to be found. I checked my children's room, and sure enough, they were both safe and sound in their beds, fast asleep." I know I sound crazy, but I'm physically shaking as I type this. To this day, I don't know what happened, and I think about it every night before I go to bed. Maybe I should speak to a sleep specialist about it, but I don't know if that would even help. All I do know is that nothing like this has ever happened to me before, and it's really been difficult to come to terms with. The little girl in the white dress on the 5th floor. Working in my local hospital has been a great opportunity for me. I don't have a medical job, but I've come across something intriguing, a ghost story. The story revolves around a little girl in a white dress who is known to haunt the hospital. She's not just confined to one area, but appears all over the place. However, she's mostly spotted on the 5th floor, which is split into 2 wings, 5 south and 5 north. 5 south serves as a temporary residence for elderly people who are waiting in their assisted living. On the other hand, 5 north is a hospice where patients go to spend their last months. Interestingly, the little girl is spotted the most on the 5th floor. Although she's considered to be a prankster and a bit mischievous, she's not believed to be evil in any way. In fact, it's believed that she's some sort of guardian angel who helps turn people into the afterlife. It's been reported that patients are dying and often ring for assistance and say that there's a little girl sitting at the end of their bed. And without fail, they always describe the same thing: a little girl dressed in white. Strangely enough, these patients would pass away within 24 hours after seeing the little girl. Not much is known about the little girl, or how she came to haunt the hospital. However, sightings of her have been happening for decades. It's a mystery that remains unsolved, but one thing is for sure. The little girl in the white dress is an enigmatic and fascinating presence in the hospital. I constantly have dreams of my dead family members. I'm starting to think it is actually them. I've lost so many people throughout my lifetime, and it's been a tremendous challenge for me. Two of the most significant losses I've ever experienced were my father and my uncle. They were half-brothers and had the same father. I was only 8 years old when my father died by suicide. And then I was 16. My uncle also died by suicide. These losses left a deep void in my life that I've never been able to fill. As I was growing up, I had many dreams in which I talked to my uncle mostly. Before he passed away, we had a conversation about his beliefs regarding the afterlife. He shared with me that he believed in the quantum theory of death, which meant that he would exist in another plane or dimension. I'd expressed my wish to have more dreams about my father, and my uncle promised me that he would visit me in my dreams after he passed away. He was only 24 years old when he died, and my father was just 26. I'll never forget the night that my uncle passed away. It was January 26th, 2019, and he had used a small pistol. At the time, I was asleep and I had a dream that I was in his car. I saw my uncle appear in the driver's seat, and I asked him what was happening. He told me how sorry he was, and I kept asking him what he did wrong. That's when I woke up to my mom calling me at 5:30 in the morning. She told me that my uncle had shot himself and warned me not to look at Facebook because some posts could trigger me. After that day, I was devastated. I threw up and sobbed constantly. Family members called me to check if I was okay because I was very close to my uncle. That night I had another dream in which I was in his car again. I asked him why he left us, and he responded by telling me that he was sorry, that he had to leave because he was in a lot of pain. He asked me not to hold on to my anger and assured me that we would be together again shortly. Weeks went by and I was still grieving when I found out in late March that I was pregnant. I was terrified because I was going to go through puberty, and my doctor told me that I wouldn't be able to carry the child in term due to my hips not being fully developed. I had another dream in Jeremy's car, and I told him about my pregnancy and how guilty I felt that I had to have an abortion at 16. He assured me that I wouldn't meet this child, that it wouldn't grow into one, and that this wasn't forever. After my surgical procedure, I kept seeing praying mantises in my room. I kept finding small garter snakes, feathers at my doorstep. I still don't know what half of them mean. Then 7 months after my uncle's suicide, I was assaulted by one of his close friends. This friend gave a speech at my uncle's funeral, and he even got his name tattooed. The attack was violent enough to give me a neck and head injury. This friend also made a movie about my uncle, and I was on the cover of the film. I was disgusted with that and prayed for my uncle to do something about it. The next day, on April 30th, he killed himself. I found out that my friend had told my aunt what he did. My aunt confronted him and he overdosed after admitting his crime. Around the same time, the man who had abused my mother died on the same day as my father. He had terrorized us for years and he was an addict. The news of his suicide hit me hard, when I felt relieved that he could no longer hurt anyone else. I also couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. Despite everything that he had done to me, he was still a human being, and I couldn't shake the feeling that his death could have been prevented had he gotten the help he needed. It was also a shock to learn that my friend had told my aunt about it. I had kept it a secret for so long, and while I knew it wasn't my fault, I still felt a sense of shame and embarrassment. But my aunt's response was nothing but supportive, and I was grateful for her compassion and understanding. The time of his death was eerie, as it coincided with the death of the man that had abused my mother. I couldn't help but feel that it was some kind of twisted justice, but at the same time, I knew that their deaths didn't erase the pain or the trauma that they had caused. In the weeks and months that followed, I struggled to come to terms with everything that happened. I sought therapy and support for the loved ones, but the scars of my trauma was still very real. It was a long journey for healing, but I knew that with time, I'd be able to move forward and find some semblance of peace. One of my many happenings. As a single mother of 3 kids, finding a house that was both big enough and cheap enough for us was a challenge. But when I stumbled upon an old house that fit the bill, I thought it was too good to be true. Little did I know that it would be the beginning of a series of strange and unexplainable events that would occur in our home. The first unusual occurrence happened one night after I'd finally gotten all 3 of my kids to bed. As my nightly ritual, I took off all my silver rings and placed them on my nightstand. I wore about 6 rings, all of which were sentimental to me. I then turned to my bed to remove the pillows and bedspread to grab my pajamas. When I turned back to my nightstand, I was startled to find all 6 of my silver rings sitting on their edges, lined up in a perfect row. At first, I thought that I'd somehow managed to do this myself without realizing it. But as I tried to recreate the same effect, I quickly realized that it was actually impossible to make the rings stand up in that manner without a lot of effort. I then purposely sat them up on their edges, which was very difficult and a balancing act. However, they kept falling over and knocking over the other rings. It was clear to me that someone or something had moved my rings to make them stand like that. This was just the beginning of the strange occurrences that happened in our home. There were times when I would hear footsteps coming from the hallway or other parts of the house, only to find that no one was there. Doors would open and close on their own, and objects would move from one place to another without explanation. My kids also reported hearing strange sounds and feeling the presence of something in their rooms at night. I tried to rationalize these occurrences by telling myself that it was just an old house. Maybe it was settling, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But as time went on, the incidents became more frequent and more bizarre. It got to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore, and I began to feel like I was living in a haunted house. Eventually, I sought the help of paranormal investigators, and I had them come check out the house. They conducted a thorough investigation and found evidence of spiritual activity in the house. They also discovered that the land on which the house was built had a dark history, which may have contributed to the haunting. With their help, we were able to cleanse the house and make it a more peaceful and comfortable environment for my family. The strange occurrences have since subsided, and the house now feels like normal and a peaceful home. Looking back on that night, when my silver rings were mysteriously lined up, seems like the tip of the iceberg compared to everything else that happened to the house. But it was certainly a sign of things to come, and a clear indication that we were not alone in our home. Encounter number 3. When my kids and I first moved into our new house, things seemed to be going smoothly. I was getting everything unpacked and organized, and we were all settling into our new home. I even got the old kitchen phone hooked up, which was still the only phone in the house. It was an old 70s wall phone, yellow with a long curly cord. I could walk around most of the first floor rooms with that long cord and talk on the phone. One day I was downstairs in the kitchen talking to my brother on the phone while the kids were upstairs doing their own thing. I walked over to the kitchen table and looked out the big window, admiring the view of our new neighborhood. Suddenly I felt 3 hard tugs on my shirt tail, just like a kid would do to get my attention. I asked my brother to hold on for a moment and turned around to see who needed me, but no one was there. I thought maybe I had tangled up on the phone cord, so I straightened it out and resumed my conversation. But not 2 minutes later, it happened again. 3 harder tugs on my shirt tail. This time I turned around quickly enough to catch whoever was messing with me. But once again, no one was there. I was pretty freaked out because I could tell the difference between accidental pulls and intentional tugs. I ended my phone call and ran upstairs to check on the kids. They were all engrossed in whatever they happened to be doing in their rooms. None of them could have tugged on my shirt and disappeared into thin air. After that incident, I started noticing other strange things happening in our house. Objects would move from one place to another without any explanation. Doors would open and close on their own. The temperature in the house would fluctuate randomly, and I would hear strange noises in the middle of the night. At first, I tried to brush it off and convince myself that it was maybe just my imagination. But the tugging on my shirt was just too real to ignore, and I started to wonder if our new house was in fact haunted. I didn't know what to do, so I turned to the internet for answers. I found a paranormal investigation group in our area and reached out for them. They came to our house and performed an investigation using all kinds of high-tech equipment to try and detect any paranormal activity. They found some unusual energy in the kitchen and in one of the upstairs bedrooms, but couldn't find any conclusive evidence of a haunting. I was still convinced that our house was haunted, so I decided to do some research on my own. I found out that our house was built on the site of an old school, which had burned down many years ago. I started to wonder if the spirits of the students who had died in the fire were still lingering in our house. I decided to try and communicate with the spirits, so I bought a Ouija board and invited some of my friends over to try it out. We had some strange experiences with the board, and I felt like we were definitely making contact with someone or something, but I wasn't sure if it was a student from the old school or something malevolent. After that, I started to feel more uneasy in my house. I didn't feel safe there anymore, and I was worried about my kids. I decided to contact a local medium to see if she could help. She came out to our house and performed a ritual to try to cleanse the energy. Since then, things have been much better. We still have the old phone in the kitchen, but I haven't felt any tugs of my shirt tail lately. The strange noises and movements have stopped, and the temperature in the house seems to be more stable. My kids haven't reported seeing anything strange happening either, which is a huge relief. I'm not sure why exactly the haunting was happening in our house, but I'm glad that we were able to find some help and make it feel more like a safe and welcoming home. It was definitely a scary experience, but I'm grateful that we were able to get through it together. On the night of my 13th birthday, I decided to spend the night at my grandma's house. I was up late playing video games, probably until 1 or 2 a.m. After a while, I got thirsty and needed to get some water, so I decided to head to the kitchen. To get there, I had to walk down a hallway and past 2 other rooms. As I was walking past the last room before the staircase, something caught my eye. I saw a flame just in the middle of a dark room. I was confused and stepped closer to get a better look. For a second, I actually thought it was my grandma standing in the dark holding a lighter. I didn't know why she would be doing that, but I thought maybe she was just confused herself. But as I got closer, I was able to make out a figure. It was all black and over 6 feet tall, and it was definitely not my grandma. The figure just stood in the doorway, looking at me while it held a flame in its hand. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. I ran as fast as I could downstairs and saw that my grandma was asleep. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. I didn't know what to make of it at all. Was it a dream, a hallucination, or was it real? I tried to rationalize it, but nothing made sense. The next morning, I tried to ask my grandma if she had seen anything strange or if anything else was in the house. She didn't even seem to understand what I was talking about. I didn't want to scare her, so I decided to keep it to myself. Years went by and I still couldn't shake off the feeling of what I'd seen that night. It was one of the only few weird things that ever happened to me, and I still don't understand any of it. To this day, I wonder what that figure was and what did it want? Help identify this, please. Greetings, my name is Joseph, and I have a bizarre encounter that puzzled me and my best friend for years. When I was a teenager, around 14 or 15, my friend, whom I'm going to call Q, used to play in the woods with me, behind my great-grandmother's old house in North Carolina. We often rode our bikes and swung on a few thick kudzu vines that grew on a small gully and gulch that ran through the woods. One afternoon in June around 1:45, we heard something running towards us, too fast to be an animal in our area, but too slow to be a human. We both bolted out of the woods as fast as we could. The odd part was that nothing chased us beyond the edge of my great-grandma's driveway. Despite our terrifying encounter during the day, we were curious kids and kept going back to see if we could catch whatever it was and figure out what it was. One night, we agreed to go around midnight to see if the reason that we couldn't catch the creature was that it was inactive during the day. We gave each other a 20-minute leeway just in case the other wasn't in the agreed-upon spot at midnight. Q was late, so I did what we agreed upon, which was, looking back now, an idiotic idea. I called out his name several times, and after the 5th time, I heard a voice that sounded like his, but not quite a yell out for help. When I looked out to where the sound seemed to come from, I saw something about 5 feet tall on all fours, standing at the end of the street, staring straight at me. I took off running hid under a moving truck for what felt like forever. The creature I saw had an odd shape, and its fur was a dark color, but it had a human-like face. I couldn't get a good look at it as I was running for my life. The last time I saw a creature was when it ran off into the woods near my great-grandmother's old house. The only reason I know I didn't imagine it is that after I bolted into my house, and my friend Q came outside and told me the exact same thing happened to him. Before I could even mention it to him the next day, he described the creature in the same way that I saw it. We never entered those woods again, and we have vowed never to set foot in them again until we know what it is and if we can kill it. Now that we're in our mid-20s, we're still searching for answers and trying to figure out what kind of creature we encountered that fateful night. We've talked to many people and we researched extensively, but still haven't found any answers. This incident has left us both with a sense of fear and unease that we haven't been able to shake off for years. Ask Reddit 1. When I was 13 or 14, I lived in Hawaii on a military base along the side of a volcanic crater known as the AMR. The townhomes we lived in were situated up along a slope of the mountains, but the last 500 feet or so was just empty hill space leading to a cliff that overlooked the crater, which did have businesses and such in it, long dormant. I lived with my family on the base, and my friends and I loved to explore the surrounding area, especially the side of the crater, which was mostly flat leading up to the edge, and there was a fence along most of it, so it wasn't as unsafe as it may sound. One day while hiking along the side of the crater, my friends and I stumbled upon an abandoned bunker, most likely from World War II, about a mile along the side of the hill. We were all very excited to go exploring, and we quickly made our way inside. The bunker was almost empty, but there was a mount for what I would assume would have been a machine gun at some point. However, what caught our attention was a locked metal door in the back of the bunker. It was pretty rusty and sounded kind of hollow, like there were a few spots that you could probably see through, except for the fact that it was pitch black inside. Despite our initial hesitation, we continued to come back to the bunker, and we would hang out and play around it all the time. And this is until the last time we went. We got there at around 5 p.m. and we were sitting around talking about random things, probably Animal Crossing or Phantasy Star Online at the time. All of a sudden, we started having this faint banging noise coming from behind the door. We froze and got super silent, and the banging was rhythmically speeding up. At first, it would be a slight bang every 15 seconds or so. Then after about 20 faint bangs, there would be a 10-second apart. Then it got to the point where they were 5 seconds apart, and then it stopped altogether. We looked at the door and noticed some of the rust powder, I don't know what it's called, like crumbled rusty door, fall off the door. We were all freaked out by this point and quickly decided to nope the fuck out of there. We started climbing the ladder out, and the person that left last, there were 3 of us, and I was scared, swears that they heard a loud bang against the door as he finished climbing out. We ran down the hill, and some MPs spotted us and told us that we weren't allowed to be up there. About 2 weeks later, they had built a fence and sanctioned off the entire area. We were still left wondering what was down there, if anything. The experience stayed with us, and we'd still talk about it years later, after we had all gone our separate ways. And it was one of those moments that stayed with you for the rest of your life. And we were all grateful to have experienced it together. A spirit has been following me around for many years. I only found out about it recently. Ever since I moved into my new house last year, I've had a feeling that it's haunted. Strange things happen, like books or glasses disappearing only to reappear in places I would never put them in. I still find missing cups or plates under my bed from time to time. My dog Joe is not a hoarder, and he never touches anything that he knows he's not allowed to, so he's not to blame. Sometimes I see things moving quickly in my peripheral vision, only to disappear as soon as I take a turn to take a better look. There have been unexpected and unexplained temperature changes and weird sounds in the middle of the night. My dog also seems to be afraid of the basement. He'll never go down there no matter what, and always barks at the door whenever he walks past it, or just walks around the dining room table to get as far away from possible from it. One hot summer night, the electricity was off, and I was sleeping when I felt a frozen cold hand squeezing my shoulder, jolting me awake with a start. I thought it was only a dream at first, but then I touched my shoulder, where the ghost hand had been only a few seconds ago, and it was still cold compared to the rest of my body, which was warm and sweaty. That's when I was really convinced that my house was indeed haunted. But apart from those weird things, I've never seen any apparition, or something far worse than just a ghostly hand groping me in the middle of the night. I've tried to coexist with the ghost by acknowledging its presence with simple gestures like saying greetings each time I arrive home or saying see you before I leave. And it seems to work out well, but a few weeks ago something happened that left me feeling even more confused and scared. I met this girl on Tinder and we agreed to hang out at my place. As soon as I opened the front door for her, her face turned pale. I invited her in, but she told me that she was sorry and that it wasn't a good idea and then left abruptly. I was confused and really offended. I mean, I know I'm not the most good-looking guy on the planet, but come on. I had sent her my photo earlier, and she seemed to have no problem with my face then, so why all of a sudden did she change her mind as soon as she saw me in person? I dropped her a message asking if there was something wrong, and she told me that she didn't want to offend my friend if we were going to have sex that night. I thought she was talking about Joe, so I said, come on, my dog won't hate me because I have a one-night stand. I know he's a good Christian, but using him for subtly ugly shaming isn't cool. Then she said she wasn't talking about Joe, but the spirit in my house. I said, oh, you can see it? And she said, yeah. I asked her what it looked like, but she refused to elaborate and only told me that it's a he. Then he asked how long I've had it in there following me around, which I didn't understand. She said she could tell that things have been following me around for a long time, which is weird. I told her I've been living there for a year, and she said the spirit's been with me long before I moved into that space. We arranged another meetup at a restaurant, and she said it was still following me around. I called my mother the other day and asked if she had ever made a deal with a spirit or something, and being a devout Christian, she and my father both took offense to my question. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this spirit than what I had previously thought. I started doing some research on my own and found out that there are many different types of spirits, and not all of them benign. Some can be malevolent, and others can be attached to a person or an object, following them wherever they go. As I delved deeper into my research, I stumbled upon the concept of residual hauntings, which occur when a traumatic event or emotion is imprinted on a location, causing it to play out repeatedly. This made me think about the history of my house and the land that it was built on. Maybe something traumatic had happened here in the past, and this is why the spirit was following me. I started looking around for more information about the history of my house and found out that it was built on the site of an old plantation. I couldn't find any information about it, or any traumatic events that might have occurred there, but I did find out that the original owners were slave owners. This information sent chills down my spine. I started to wonder if the spirit following me was that of a slave who had suffered on this land. I wonder if he was angry or seeking revenge. And that was why he was making his presence known. I didn't know what to do, so I turned to the paranormal investigator to help. The investigator came to my house and performed an investigation. He found evidence of a residual haunting in the basement, but he couldn't find any evidence of a malevolent spirit. He suggested that I try to communicate with the spirit and see if I could find out what it wanted. I was hesitant at first, but eventually I decided to try. I sat in the basement with a candle and asked the spirit to communicate with me. At first there was silence, but then I heard a faint whisper. It was hard to make out what the spirit was saying, but it sounded like maybe he was asking for help. I was taken back by this, and I asked the spirit what kind of help it needed. The spirit stopped, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me. Suddenly, I knew what I had to do. I needed to help the spirit move on to the afterlife. I contacted a local psychic medium. She came to my house to help me. She performed a ritual to help the spirit move on, and it worked. The strange occurrences in my house stopped, and I felt a sense of peace that I'd never felt before. Looking back on this experience, I realized that not all spirits are malevolent, and sometimes they just need help moving on. I also learned that it's essential to do your research and seek professional help when dealing with the paranormal. I think we saw an extraterrestrial spacecraft 5 years ago. I remember the day vividly. It was 5 years ago. I was hanging out with 3 of my friends at a place on a hill overlooking the ocean. The view was breathtaking and the sky looked so beautiful, a few minutes before sunset. It was one of those moments where you just want to capture the beauty and cherish it forever. Little did we know that something bizarre was about to happen that would change our perspective forever. Out of nowhere, I noticed a small ball of light floating over the ocean, far away below. It was quite far to see it clearly, so at first we thought it was probably a small fishing boat. We couldn't tell how fast it was either, but as we kept watching it, the ball of light started to float closer to the surface, moving in a straight line. We still couldn't tell what it was until suddenly it started to move upwards. And it didn't stop. It just kept going up and up until the sky grew darker and it became too small for us to see. We were all stunned and couldn't believe what we had just witnessed. We started to question what it could be, and none of us could come up with any reasonable explanations. It was simply too baffling and out of the ordinary. Initially, we didn't think it was extraterrestrial in nature because it had never occurred to us that something like that would ever even happen where we lived. However, as years passed, and we still hadn't figured out what it was, I started to wonder if it had actually been an extraterrestrial object. Maybe we had been too stunned and confused to take our phones out and record it. It still haunts me that we might have missed our chance to capture this once-in-a-lifetime event. Since that day, I've been obsessed with trying to find an explanation for what we saw. I've researched extensively and read countless articles and reports on UFO sightings, trying to find something that could explain what we witnessed. But nothing seemed to fit the bill. It was as if we saw something that didn't exist in any scientific or logical realm. I've shared this experience with people, but it's hard for anyone to believe it without evidence. However, the experience was so profound that it's left an indelible mark on me. It made me realize how much we don't really know the universe or the possibilities that exist beyond our own planet. Sometimes I think about the small ball of light floating over the ocean, and I wonder what it really was. Was it an extraterrestrial object, or was it something else entirely? I may never know the answer, but one thing's for sure. That experience changed my life forever. Spirit has been pretending to be me. When I was around 9 years old, my younger sister and I were playing a game of hide and seek in our small house. I always tried to hide in the small enclosed spaces so I wouldn't be found easily. That day I decided to hide in our toy closet. While hiding, I saw a light green glow growing to my left, and when I turned to face it, I saw a figure that looked like me but taller, with a dead look in its eyes. The figure was wearing a white shirt with yellow-green stars, and the glow came from the shirt and lightly consumed its figure. I was frozen with fear and didn't know what I was even seeing. Was it real or just my imagination? After a while, I pushed the door open and ran out of the room to find my sister. I told her what had happened and she believed me. We took pictures with my DSi, but we couldn't find anything out of the ordinary on them except for one odd frame that my sister found later. She left the DSi in that room out of fear for what she found in that frame, and I never even saw the picture. Now, 13 years old, odd things have happened since that moment, but we all shrugged it off. However, my sister was particularly bothered by it. One day while I was home alone with her, watching SpongeBob on TV, when suddenly the television turned off for no reason. I looked for the remote, but it was on a table a little away from me, and I heard my own voice not coming from my mouth, but from my parents' room, far away from me and my sister, and all I heard was, "Mom?" I was scared but shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. However, this happened 2 more times, but to my sister and mother while the TV was off, and they both heard me calling out for my mom from my mother's room. It was strange because I wasn't home at the time, and my mother thought it was my sister who said it. I was confused and scared. Can someone tell me more about what this thing could be? Was it a ghost or something else? The single manifestation looked like me, but taller and had a dead look in its eyes. Could it have connections to the voices that we heard? I didn't know, and it bothered me a lot. However, we continued to live in the house, and nothing strange happened again. I hope it was just my overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew there was something else going on. Someone who wasn't there stayed upstairs, the upstairs boogeyman. When I got married, my husband and I moved into an old house that he inherited. The house was built in the early 1920s, and although it had visible age and history, my husband had been working on remodeling it and had made a decent amount of progress by the time that we moved in. However, there was something about the house that never felt quite right. I couldn't explain it, but it just felt off. Maybe it was because I knew a couple of my husband's family members had passed away in the house. I experienced all the typical ghostly encounters that you hear about. The feeling of being watched, the feeling of not being alone when you were alone, and so on. But there was one experience that even my husband was baffled about. One night, he and I had settled into bed, and we were on our way into falling asleep when we heard movement upstairs. At first, I didn't move or say anything, thinking I had imagined it, but the sound of footsteps above us got louder and louder. My husband sat up saying, "You hear that too, right?" I was pretty much shaking and mumbled, "Of course." As it sounded like the footsteps were running across the upper floor, my husband hopped out of bed and ran to the door and up the stairs. A few minutes later, he came back down the stairs into our bedroom and shut the door. At first, he didn't answer when I asked what it was. After prying at him again, he simply said, "I'm sure it's just my great-grandmother checking in on us. She was one of the family members who had passed away in the house." But I wasn't convinced. This didn't feel like a friendly family ghost just visiting. It felt plain malicious to me. After that night, I started hearing the sounds of movement upstairs when no one was up there. Then the distinctive squeaking noise of our stairs when someone was walking on them started happening when I was alone downstairs. I can still feel the chills all over me when I'd hear this right behind me while sitting on the couch in the downstairs living room. One day my friend had the bright idea to buy a Ouija board and to use it in the house. After telling her some of what I was experiencing, she was dying to try and see if anything would make contact. I flat out refused, but did keep the board upon her insisting that I may at some point want to try it. I took the board, still in its box, and placed it on a shelf at the top of a small linen closet we had. I closed the door with every intention of forgetting the board was even there. However, after this, that closet door never stayed shut. I would find it half open almost every time I walked by it. I started thinking I was actually shutting it completely, and it got to the point where I'd make sure I heard the door latch and would even pull on the doorknob to be sure that it wasn't open. Yet sometime later, I'd go get a towel and find it half open. All while, it would just be me in the house. I'll never forget one of the terrifying experiences I had before we finally moved out. My husband was working a double shift at his job, and it was dark by the time I made it back home that evening. After getting home, I went to straightening up the house. As I was picking things up, I reached down and nearly grabbed a massive black spider. I recoiled in horror before realizing it was a fake plastic spider my nephew had been playing with earlier in the day. I was half relieved and half annoyed, as I was always on edge any time I was alone in the house anyway, and grabbed the creepy toy and flung it hard up the stairs. There is a bedroom up there where I kept toys for my nephew when he visited. I planned to pick it up and pack it away in his toy box when I went up there to straighten up the room later. Side note, my nephew was terrified to sleep up there and would often not play up there alone because of what he called spookies. As I turned away from the steps to go back to cleaning the downstairs, I heard a whooshing through the air and then something slam against the wall at the bottom of the steps. I jumped to see what in the world it was and felt my blood run ice cold. There, that stupid toy spider lay on the floor at the bottom of the steps, as if someone or something had thrown it back down the stairs, hard. I left that house. I left with my keys and my phone and called my husband. I told him that I was going to my parents' house until he got home. As previously mentioned, we moved shortly after this experience, and I was never alone in that house after dark again. That house has sat vacant since we left, still debating on selling or renting it out. My husband still insists that it was his prankster grandmother. I still refer to it as the upstairs boogeyman. Thinking back on that experience, I wonder what exactly was causing those strange occurrences in that old house. Was it the lingering presence of a deceased family member, or was it something much darker and more sinister? I may never know, but I'm glad to be farther away from that house. My parents' dream house turned into a haunted nightmare. I was born in the early 90s in a time when the world was changing rapidly. My parents got married in 1991, and I came along in 1992. For the first 2 years of their marriage, my parents lived in a tiny apartment that needed a lot of work. When my mom found out that she was pregnant with me, finding a better home with more space moved to the top of their to-do list. My mom was about 7 months pregnant with me, and every house that they had looked at had fallen through. Until one. The one. It was located out in the middle of nowhere of our little town, but that's exactly what my parents wanted. It was a 2, could be 3, bedroom and 1 bath house. It had 2 enclosed porches, a massive kitchen and dining area, and a living room. The best part was that rent was just barely over the amount my parents were paying monthly for this tiny rundown apartment. While this wasn't a beachside luxury mansion, it was everything my parents wanted, and then some. Of course, they jumped on the offer. It didn't take long after moving in for the weirdness to start. Activity made itself known pretty much from day one. This experience in particular, I can remember even though I was only 3 or 4 years old. Halloween has always been a major holiday for the family. My parents decided to host their first annual Halloween party in this house. It was a huge success, in fact. Tons of family and friends attended. They had music, food, games, costume contests. I remember I was Baby Bob from Barney. And the best part, a fake haunted house in the garage that sat apart from the house. After it was over, my mom's 2 sisters and her middle sister's boyfriend decided to sleep over instead of making the hour-long drive back home so late. My parents made the living room floor, which was in between my parents' room and what I considered to be my room, as cozy as they could. At about 2 a.m., we said our goodnights and I followed my parents into their room to crash, as I was absolutely terrified of my room. I remember waking up to the sound of someone knocking on my parents' closed bedroom door. My dad was dead to the world, so my mom got up to answer it. I heard the frantic voice of my older aunt asking where my dad was. My mom opened the bedroom door more so she could see that my dad was completely knocked out in the bed. My aunt's voice became even more pleading as she asked if they could all move into their room and sleep on the floor. My mom agreed, as my aunt swore that she would explain it in the morning, but not now. I remember how excited I was to see my aunt and my future uncle moving their bedding into the small bedroom to sleep. It was my first sleepover in my young mind. Come morning, or later in the morning, I should say, we would find out what exactly had happened. My aunt said that after everyone had gone to bed and the lights were out, they started hearing movements coming from my room. At first it sounded like footsteps walking around. Then it started sounding like someone was moving stuff around. It got louder, like someone was digging through my toy box. Both my aunts and my future uncle were on alert, listening to this when creepy music started playing. They realized it was the music from my dollhouse, and it would play only when you pushed a special button. They were convinced my dad was behind this, as he is notorious for playing pranks on people. That's when my aunt ran and knocked on my parents' bedroom door to see if it was somehow his doing. When my mom showed her he was sound asleep, she said it felt like her heart stopped as she could still hear movement coming from my room on the other side of the living room. After this, the experiences in the houses got worse. It was a very long time before my aunts and uncle would even visit again. Just days after this incident, my parents said I came running to them late one evening, completely inconsolable. I said in between sobs that there was a mean face glaring at me through the living room window. This window was in the same area my family had run from. Is anyone interested in hearing my experiences seeing heaven? When I was about 13 years old, I had an out-of-body experience that transported me to a place that was not of this earth. Let me begin to explain some background information that ties into what happened. I've been involved in my church my entire life, although I never really cared for it. When I was old enough, I became part of the staff team, and I was sort of a junior usher, responsible for catching people who fell and the seating of those who were walking in. Even though I wasn't too into the whole church thing, I enjoyed my job. Oftentimes, while the pastor would pray over people, you could feel the energy in the air. The air would thicken and it would suddenly get hot. I even watched crazy people get unpossessed. A few months into doing this, I began to become quite intrigued by how it all worked, as I've always enjoyed the paranormal, but I wasn't ready for what I was about to experience. It was my night off from ushering, so I was mixed into the congregation. I loved to sit in the background and blend in, but for some odd reason, I wanted to sit up front. I stood and clapped, singing along with the band and singers, trying not to stand out. I was already nervous being close to the front. Suddenly in my ear, the music began to fade to background noise, and I heard something whisper in my ear, "Let's go," in a commanding yet angelic voice. Creeped out, I stopped singing and clapping. Panic set in. I began to question what was happening, and it was almost quiet. Again I heard, "Just let go." By now I was sweating, and I ignored it and I tried to focus on the band on stage. I said to myself, I can barely hear them, yet they're right there. Panic turned into fear. The voice came back. "Joseph, do not fear, let go, and let me show you something." This time, the voice was comforting. It eased my panic and fear, and I closed my eyes. Suddenly I felt my arms begin to lift on their own, commanded by something subconsciously. As my arms reached full extension, a calmness came over me. The music faded into a mute. It was dead silent, and I felt a hand embrace mine. At this point, I wasn't scared. It all seemed familiar in a way, like home. I was not even bothered by the hand touching mine. I must have stood there for a few minutes, yet my arms felt weightless, and they didn't grow tired. The voice found me again in the dark. What I'm going to show you, not many have seen. You get to see this because you are special, and I need you to fulfill your time on this earth. You will do many things in your lifetime, cast out spirits, speak to dry bones, and tell prophecies. The voice didn't scare me, it just gave me comfort. Look up, child. Open your eyes and see. I opened my eyes and it was nothing, a dark void. I began to scan the plane I was in and spotted a hallway with a distorted light at the end. I walked toward the light and it was almost calling my name, inviting me in. As I walked into this hall, which I can only describe as a movie theater hall, right before you see the screen, it was lined with lights where the floor met the wall. Yet, as much as I studied them, I couldn't tell where the source of light originated from. And as I got closer to this distorted light, sound started coming through. I could hear music, yet it was nothing like anything I've ever experienced before. It was like my senses were heightened and everything was more vivid and intense than in the physical world. As I looked around, I realized that I was not alone. There were other beings there with me, but they were different from the people I'd seen on Earth. They were glowing, and their energy was palpable. They emanated a sense of love and compassion that was beyond anything I'd ever felt before. They had an aura of wisdom and serenity that was almost overwhelming. One of the beings approached me, and I felt a wave of peace and calm wash over me. It communicated with telepathy, and I could understand everything it said without words. It told me that I was there for a reason, and that I had a purpose in life, and that I had a mission to fulfill. The being showed me visions of my future and the things I would do, the people I would meet and the experiences I would have. It told me that I would encounter challenges and hardships, but that I would find joy and fulfillment in my life's work. It showed me a glimpse of my destiny, and I knew in my heart that it was true. As I stood there surrounded by the love and light of these beings, I felt a sense of belonging that I'd never felt before. I felt like I was home, that this is where I truly belonged. I knew that I'd come back to the physical world, but I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay there forever, surrounded by the beauty and the peace of this otherworldly realm. But the being told me that it was time for me to go back. It said that I had a lot of work to do, but I had to fulfill my purpose and live out my destiny. It embraced me one last time, and I felt a surge of energy flow through my body. Suddenly, I was back in the church, standing in the middle of the congregation. As I looked around, everything seemed different. The colors were brighter, the air was cleaner, and the people seemed more alive. I felt a sense of gratitude and love for everyone around me, and I knew that I'd been given a gift that I could never repay. I knew that I had to share my experience with others and help them see that there was more to life than just the physical world. From that day on, my life was never the same. I went on to become a spiritual leader and healer, using my gift to help others find their own purpose and destiny. I traveled the world sharing my stories and spreading the message of love and compassion that I'd learned in that otherworldly realm. And although I knew that I could never fulfill or describe the beauty and wonder of that place, I also knew that I would carry its memory with me always, as a reminder of the power of love and the promise of a greater destiny. A poltergeist that hated blondes. My story started in 1982. My dad had been in the military for 32 years, and then had worked for NASA before he retired. Because of his military service, he and my mom were eligible to travel anywhere in the world by military transport, if there was available room, and pay a nominal fee for meals while in flight. They had never been to Hong Kong, and it had long been on their bucket list. They arranged for the trip, which would have been about 2 weeks if I remember correctly. They were worried about leaving their house empty for that long and asked me to house sit. There had been a string of burglaries in the area, but they targeted houses that were all sale or empty. Now, the house I grew up in was not a very cozy or warm or fuzzy place. The rumor that I heard when we moved in was that a boy of 13 had killed himself with a shotgun a couple of years prior to us moving in. I had never been able to substantiate the rumor, and it was definitely verboten in my house to ask about it. It was a standard ranch in the burbs, built in probably 1968 or 1969, when California started booming and my parents got a suspiciously good deal on it, but I digress. This house just did not feel friendly. Even with all the windows and doors open, it felt dark. When you entered the front door, you had a kitchen and a family to your right, living room to the left, and a long hallway leading back to 4 bedrooms and 2 baths. Classic L shape with the tiled roof of the pseudo-Halencia. The energy made me nervous. Quite often at night, you would hear footsteps going down the hall turning and going to the kitchen. There was a built-in desk where we kept a phone or an answering machine and a fax machine. Without fail, we could hear the fax machine dialing and the phone speaker would pick up ringing. No one ever answered, thank God. My dad was an ex-search and rescue man. He quickly shut down any discussion. If you grew up military, you understand that one look would wilt you in your seat. They left for their trip, and I nervously settled in. I had the instinct to keep myself near the front of the house. I chose the family room couch in order to stay as close to the front door as possible. Things have a habit of pretty much saying, I see you. And I have to say, I see you too, which can lead to a pretty nasty standoff. The first night there, I stayed up late and finally went to sleep at about 2 a.m. At 3 o'clock, right before the dot. I know the cliche. The little entity came walking down the hall, step, shuffle, step, all the way into the kitchen. I waited for it to start dialing. Nope, it paused, and the footsteps came right up to where I was lying on the couch. I was feeling an energy surge, but I didn't see anything. My impression was that it was agitated. In my head, I heard, move. I was trying to wake up and pull myself together when it said again, move. More urgent, and I sat up and started putting my shoes on. There was a kitchen between me and the front door. I was flabbergasted that this thing and I had even been afraid of. It was more scared than I was. I was shaking and fumbling for my car keys. This thing was screaming in my head, move, please, go. Please go now. And I bolted for the kitchen. As I got to the edge of the dining room, I heard what this ghost was afraid of. It sounded huge. Heavy footsteps boomed down the hall. Something growled, and I heard the farthest bedroom door slam. Then the next one, then the next one. Only one doorway left before it got to the kitchen. I grabbed the front doorknob, frantically tried to get it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was unlocked, but there was so much pressure that I couldn't pull it open. The last door slammed, and I prayed for help to get it open. It suddenly popped open so hard that I fell backwards into the wall, scrambled outside onto my hands and knees. Behind me, the front door slammed so hard that the wood frame splintered in an area about 3 inches across. I sat in the car until dawn. I never again went into that house at night. I took a friend back with me to check it before dark every night. My parents sold it to my sister when they downsized, but I never went over there again. Years later, I sold this story to a friend of mine, Nick, who had spent time with me over there when we were in high school. His comment? That poltergeist that hates blondes? Yes, Nick had felt it too. We're both blondes. It had trapped him in the kitchen one day. I wondered why he had suddenly stopped coming over.